President Trump has officially announced a 2-week ceasefire with Iran. The ceasefire was mediated by Pakistan and was conditional on the opening of the Strait of Hormuz, which Iran claims it will carry out. The strait will be opened. Let's bring in retired Navy intelligence officer, national security analyst, and host of the Strat podcast, Hal Kempfer. Hal, we've asked the public to send in questions, and Aaron is asking about something that I'm also curious about. What is Iran's plan during this 2-week ceasefire? How long is 2 weeks? And what kind of things can Iran do during that period?
Well, Austin, first of all, 2 weeks is not a long time, all right? But what I'll be looking for tomorrow is to see if they're going to open the Strait of Hormuz. That's a requirement. That's a non-negotiable condition. In other words, a condition for the ceasefire is that they open the Strait of Hormuz. If the Strait of Hormuz isn't open, then why are we having a ceasefire? So that's the first thing, and Iran needs to comply with that. You know, one of the questions is, did Iran do something like mine parts of the main shipping routes that go through the Strait of Hormuz? And do they know where those mines are? Are they able to remove those mines and clear that area? I don't think they can, and I'm not even sure if they know where they put all the mines. The main point here is that maritime insurance will determine a lot of this. A risk assessment is needed that allows rates to drop so ships can actually transit going in and out of the Strait of Hormuz, and a lot needs to happen quickly. Now, if they manage to pull this off, it's not so much about what Iran will gain, but about what the world gains. Obviously, a lot of oil, natural gas, increasingly essential, as well as fertilizers. We will face a food security crisis next year if we don't distribute the necessary fertilizer for global agriculture. So this is absolutely crucial. It's planting season now, and they need to get the fertilizer into the fields for this to happen. So that's going to be a big challenge. Now, what is Iran going to do? Iran will have to negotiate seriously. They will need to do something big that they don't want to do, allow international inspections, as well as transfer the enriched uranium to another country. Actually, there is a lot that needs to happen, and I don't see how this can be set aside. Now, these 2 weeks are meant to be used to negotiate another 2 weeks or another week or whatever it may be. And once things are flowing in and out of the Strait of Hormuz, if the discussions are going in the right direction, you might see this being extended. To become a longer ceasefire, we'll see what happens. First, we'll see if they fulfill this initial part. Tonight, you might already know the phrase, the calm before the storm. Well, in Middle Eastern ceasefires, there's usually a storm before the calm when everyone fires as much as possible before the ceasefire takes effect. And we noticed that Iran fired ballistic missiles after the ceasefire took effect. They stopped shortly after, but missiles were falling around Israel and in other parts of the Middle East. And the question was, who authorized it? Do they really have full control over their security apparatus?
Yes, I was reading on Axios that U.S. officials told Axios they anticipate the lower levels of the IRGC. They received these messages. It was written as if they were delayed. That was exactly one of the questions I was going to ask. They say that if a message like that is delayed for the lower ranks of the IRGC, it makes sense that some missiles would be fired after the ceasefire. But if we could investigate this, why does it take so long for the lower-ranking members of the IRGC to receive important messages like, "Hey, stop shooting"?
Part of it is that we degraded their command, control, and communications network during this war. We did a lot of things that are less visible to outside observers, but we significantly degraded their ability to communicate with their scattered units. If you remember, when all this started, it was a decapitation strike that eliminated the supreme leader and 49 others from the top ranks. And we saw this delayed effect. There was a slow response, a delayed retaliation. You knew that Iran was going to retaliate, but it was a slow retaliation before it finally started. That happened because of this very restricted command and control system they had, where only the main decision makers were involved. It's an autocratic system that doesn't reward initiative at the lower levels. That's why they wait for the high command, the headquarters, to give them an order. If the last order was to shoot, they'll keep shooting, regardless of what they think about the situation, until someone specifically tells them to stop. If that line of communication is degraded and there's a delay in the order, you'll see missiles being launched. The concern is that someone there could have actually said, "Ray, keep shooting just a little longer. Let's take a little more risk and launch a few more missiles at the end," hoping to provoke a response that would then allow them to claim that the other side violated the ceasefire. So, I think we'll find out more about this and what the details are, but it's something we need to keep an eye on.
Yes, it's also important to point out that, according to initial reports, this doesn't affect only the United States and Iran. This will also bring about a ceasefire where Israel is concerned, as well as in Lebanon. Obviously, Hezbollah and the Israeli Defense Forces are also at war with each other. We see footage from the Israeli Defense Forces of attacks carried out in Iran and Lebanon. Paul asks, aren't the Separkana afraid that Iran will use this time to mobilize its units for a strategic attack?
We will monitor this closely, and in terms of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, ISR will be operating throughout this entire period. We will watch everything they do to see if they are using this period to clear collapsed tunnels in those underground missile cities. We will monitor this closely, watching for any activity at their nuclear facilities. In the Strait of Hormuz, we will keep an eye on anti-ship missiles, small boats, or midget submarines. We will monitor all of this very closely. For two reasons. First, to find out if they are preparing to return to war or to do something nefarious or sneaky that could be harmful. The second thing is, if the ceasefire collapses, we want to strike these assets effectively to achieve the maximum effect in the shortest time. So we will keep an eye on them. Very, very closely, but it's a real issue. The real question is, what will happen? My impression is that behind the scenes, the rumblings among the 80 to 90% of the Iranian population who are already tired of the regime are growing. And I have a feeling that something is going to happen over there. I don't think that despite the draconian actions the regime has taken, killing tens of thousands of Iranian protesters in January and December, this feeling within Iran's body politic is going to disappear. And I have a feeling that this is going to come to the surface at some point. I just keep wondering when that's going to happen.
Christian Datoke, White House reporter at the Washington Examiner, says the government has not detailed Iran's 10-point plan. Caroline Levitt says, President Trump's words speak for themselves. Negotiations are possible and will continue. The truth is that President Trump and our powerful army forced Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, and the negotiations are ongoing. More news from Secretary Hegseth and the Chief of the General Staff tomorrow at the press conference. By the way, Reuters says that Iranian state TV claims that Trump accepted Iran's terms to end the war, describing it as a humiliating withdrawal by the President of the United States. Raul, what's your reaction to how the United States and Iran are characterizing this ceasefire?
I'll say this. Yeah, President Trump doesn't take it well when people say things about him. Other presidents would just say, all right, I'm not going to worry about it. But President Trump, when he hears words like that, tends to react. And I think it was a strategic mistake, certainly in their communication, to use language like that. Describing this as a humiliating defeat, speaking for President Trump, is a mistake. And I think, it's a mistake that could turn into some kind of kinetic action later or other types of action. They saw what we can do with that, rescuing our weapons systems officer who was shot down, and also how we can mobilize and bring a lot of resources into the interior of Iran. So I wonder what they're thinking, because I believe it's the entrenched Revolutionary Guard who can't let go of their rhetoric for the greater good and puts out things like this. But I think it's a real mistake for them to say that kind of thing.
I think a big question that many people have is how to avoid ending up in the same position again in 2 weeks. Hormuz is an important part, and what other key parts do you look at?
I'm looking at several pieces, and I think the strait should be completely open with traffic flowing through there. As soon as the traffic flows, we'll closely monitor the assets that Iran has in the area to strike them effectively if this isn't extended, right? The second thing is that although overt military operations against Iran are suspended, the United States and Israel won't stop covert actions behind the scenes. So a lot will still happen over there in those 2 weeks. Hopefully Iran won't break the ceasefire. Hopefully we won't see drone attacks and ballistic missile attacks. A key question is what the Houthis will do in Yemen. They threaten to block the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and close that route through which 12% of global trade passes. What passes through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which leads to the Suez Canal. And that's why there's a lot of concern that if this strait opens, the other one closes, and we end up going back to the situation we were in before, with one vital waterway half open or half secure, and the other being half closed by this Iranian proxy group. So there are a lot of things we need to watch because I think the situation is still much, much more dynamic. I wouldn't, as we like to say in the Marine Corps, I wouldn't put down my backpack just yet.
So let's go to Todd's question. What violates this 2-week ceasefire? And what would be the appropriate response to that?
That's an excellent question. And I'm going to give a very lawyer-like answer, and I'm not a lawyer, but I would say it depends. It really depends on what that violation would be. And if we consider that this violation is a complete annulment of the agreement in force, and that, we suspend the ceasefire and immediately return to full-scale kinetic operations, or if it's an isolated case, a mistake, or something like that. One of the areas that really falls into this gray zone is there are terrorist attacks or attacks carried out by groups acting on Iran's behalf. How are we going to judge these cases? How are we going to assess these cases? Today we had a series of explosions in Baghdad right around the embassy of Ceasefire. Was this an Iranian attack or is this something internal there? Is it almost certain that it's linked to the Popular Mobilization Forces militias, which have a direct connection with Iran? So the question is, how are we going to deal with this? What happens if they, try to blow up an embassy or if they kill a lot of Americans in a third country? And if there are many possible scenarios and it really depends on how we interpret this? What if it was a deliberate action by Iran to wage war by other means? And if that's the case, should we simply abandon all pretense and then break the ceasefire and continue with our kinetic action? There's a lot of discussion about this.
There was a lot of discussion about what Trump posted today, saying that an entire civilization will die tonight irreversibly. He posted that on Truth Social Hal, and now the current reality couldn't be more different. There has been a ceasefire now, but I ask about his words. He said, an entire civilization will die tonight. What's the purpose of that statement? Yes. Is it a matter of bluffing? Would that be the word for something like that?
I'll say this. This is the text he wrote this weekend when he used the F word. In the middle of a text, I was a bit surprised by it. And I heard several news anchors trying to report this and thinking, should I say that word on air or not? That was quite surprising. But what I'll say is this. When you spend some time in the Middle East, you notice something that sounds strange. If you remember Corporal Klinger and Mesh, he used some pretty colorful swear words. There's some truth to that. In the Middle East, the rhetoric and language used are certainly much more, let's say, colorful. In many cases, they're things that would just make us shake our heads and think, my God, what are you trying to say? Like the mother of all battles, when Saddam Hussein or terrorist groups from the Middle East spoke in apocalyptic terms to our Western ears, it really sounds striking. Something that makes us shake our heads and think, how do you do that? The interesting thing is that by saying this to Western capitals and to the UN, everyone thinks you can't act like that. Lawyers are already warning that using this kind of language before carrying out attacks could lead to accusations of war crimes based on what was said. But if your audience is sitting in Tehran and you use this kind of language, if your audience is the leadership of the Revolutionary Guard, they see the world a little differently. They see, we always say to speak softly and carry a big stick. In the Middle East, it's the opposite. You speak very loudly and dramatically, and what you actually do ends up lagging behind, but it's not as strong as your initial words. What President Trump did was put the rhetoric first, which is not a Western approach, far from Western diplomacy in terms of communication, but it seems that it had an impact. Strangely enough, we are in a ceasefire, a last-minute agreement, even though we sat there and said it was unacceptable language or something like that. In the international discourse in Tehran, I think this had an effect on the thinking and processing of the central leadership of the Revolutionary Guard, saying, "You have a president named Zikula. The president said that, wow, some would say that's how we would talk. Not Zillion, really impressive." Actually, I think it might have been a bit to make an impact, and it seems like the effect worked.
As you know, in recent weeks there have been reports about how Iran's neighbors in the Persian Gulf have been reacting to all of this. Of course, the Strait of Hormuz has been a major point of attention throughout this conflict, but you see some of the Gulf states there like the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, the Saudis, Kuwait, how they feel about this war coming to a ceasefire. I think I've seen some discussions out there and that may have been properly reported. Indirectly, not a direct quote from any of these countries, but I remember reading some reports saying that some of these countries might not mind if the war continued because they wouldn't mind seeing more destruction of the Iranian regime. So, if you're Saudi or from the United Arab Emirates today, how is the news of this ceasefire being processed?
Both countries have expressed that they would like to see this over. Anyway, they want to see this. They don't just want a quick ceasefire and to get stuck. Now the question is this a quick ceasefire? I observed what was happening there. We have 2 Marine units there. Looking at those small islands in the strait, we had the means to take them and hold them, and physical control of the Strait of Hormuz. I'm not saying there wouldn't be threats, but we would have predominant control. 3 of those islands are sovereign territory of the United Arab Emirates, so they would quickly take them back. Going north to Karg, we hit the island last night, which is where 90% of the oil comes from. We hit 50 targets there. I don't know what's left from the previous attack in which we hit military targets on Karg Island, but I believe Karg Island was open to an invasion, which would probably be elements of the 82nd Airborne taking and holding the island. At that point, Iran would have little capacity to export oil because we control its main oil center. They have a small port in the Gulf of Oman, but frankly, it would be a strike mission and that port would be shut down. They would have no way to export oil, which would cut off all the regime's revenue. Although the IRGC militia is fanatical without payment, at some point they will become discontented revolutionaries and will stop doing what they are ordered to do because they need to support their families. So, I think there was a lot going on there. But I think Saudi Arabia, I think part of what forced this was that rhetoric from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, which was convincing. The regime in Tehran that if the United States takes these islands, there will be a local occupation force that can hold these islands. And that, I think, scared them. They wonder, will we get these islands back?
So, to clarify a few points, because for much of the day, many in Iran were preparing for the United States to carry out some kind of large-scale operation, these are videos of bridges in the region. So, there actually were people there? Yeah, there it is, yeah.
There they are.
A large human chain that they formed out there at some of those energy facilities that President Trump had said he would attack if the Iranians didn't reach an agreement with the White House. We're getting this from the AP. They say that the Israeli army claims the country is still attacking Iran, even after the White House said that Israel agreed to a ceasefire. Is there any reason for us to look further into this, besides what you and I were just talking about a little while ago, which is this? At the very least, it's common to see people fire one last shot before the ceasefire.
I saw something very similar. Israel was still carrying out some attack missions. Iran was launching some things, and Israel was also operating at the same time. And they were wrapping everything up, bringing some issues to the surface, so to speak. Let's see if things calm down. From what I understand now, if you are in Tel Aviv or in Doha or in Dubai, things have calmed down. Basically, you're not seeing signs of ballistic missiles or anything else. Although earlier, right after the ceasefire announcement, they were seeing that. I think both sides will take a while to cool down here and to kind of settle into the ceasefire. At least that's what I hope. The big question I have is what will happen in Lebanon with Hezbollah. That's a bit ambiguous to me regarding what the situation is, because it's not directly linked to the Strait of Hormuz or to Iran. It's more indirect, and I just keep wondering, certainly with the way Hezbollah usually violates ceasefires at the slightest sign, I can see that this sector in particular could escalate very quickly while everything else might be calming down.
Yes, if the ceasefire takes time to reach the lower ranks of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, how long will it take to also reach the Hezbollah members who are firing at northern Israel? Leave a look at Beirut. It's past 4:30 in the morning in Lebanon and Israel. Raul, we're almost wrapping up. What stands out to you right now? We have 2 weeks of ceasefire. What will you be following in the coming days?
Will the strait open in the coming days?
Right.
And if the strait doesn't open, then what's the point of this? If we can't get fuel, gas, goods, and fertilizers flowing through the strait again, then what's the point of all this after all? Otherwise, the ceasefire could end very quickly. I will also keep an eye on any intelligence data that comes up about Iranian actions. Strengthen the defenses, dig things out of bombed areas, get their weapons back in order. In other words, are they doing those things they consider necessary to start another offensive action? That's something I'll also keep an eye on. I will certainly observe Israel's compliance with the ceasefire as well. I will be watching everything closely, both immediately and in the long term. I will closely follow the negotiations themselves. They are going to Islamabad. The Pakistanis are mediating all of this, and I want to see if any real progress will be made. And specifically, I'm keeping an eye on the nuclear issue. Will this lead to uranium enrichment? Will there be an agreement on that? Can we resolve this? Can we finally achieve what we've been trying for so long? That's going to be a big question, and if they manage to make some progress on the nuclear enrichment issue, I think that opens up a series of other opportunities for the situation to be de-escalated in the coming months.
Raul Kempfer, former naval officer and host of the Strat podcast. Listen to Strat on any podcast platform.
Thank you, Raul.
All right. Thank you, Austin.